The morning of my daughter's graduation, I woke up early, not because I was excited. I just couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe the way old houses do, the creak of the floorboard settling, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant sound of a neighbor's sprinkler clicking on too early. I had lived in that house for 11 years. I knew every sound it made. My wife, Diane, was still asleep beside me. I watched her for a moment. She looked peaceful. That was the thing about Diane. She always looked peaceful, even when everything around her was quietly falling apart. I got up, went downstairs, and made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree I planted the summer after we got married had grown taller than the fence now. My stepdaughter Kayla used to climb it when she was 12. She'd sit up there for hours with a book, and I'd bring her lemonade and pretend not to notice when she dropped it, trying to reach down without losing her page. That was 9 years ago. Today, she was graduating from the University of Michigan with a degree in business. I had paid every tuition bill, every housing fee, every textbook charge for 4 years. I had co-signed her apartment lease when she was a junior. I had driven 8 hours round trip when her car broke down outside Toledo at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I had done all of it without being asked twice. I poured my coffee and told myself today was going to be a good day. I almost believed it. We drove separately to Ann Arbor. Diane said it made more sense because her mother was coming from the other direction and they wanted to ride together into the venue. I said that was fine. I didn't push back. That was something I had learned to stop doing over the years, pushing back on the small things that didn't seem worth a fight. I found my seat in the third row of the outdoor ceremony. The morning was warm, the kind of late May weather that makes Michigan feel like it's apologizing for everything it put you through in February. Families were filling in around me, everyone dressed up, everyone smiling, everyone with their phones out and their foam fingers and their handmade signs. I had a small bouquet of sunflowers on my lap, Kayla's favorite. I had remembered. I always remembered. Diane arrived about 20 minutes before the ceremony started. She was with her mother, Gloria, who gave me a thin smile and sat down without a hug. And then I saw who was walking behind them. His name was Derek. He was Kayla's biological father. He had been mostly absent since Kayla was 4 years old. He paid child support sporadically for a few years and then stopped entirely. I stepped in when Kayla was 8, married Diane when Kayla was 9, and had been her father in every way that counted since then. Derek had resurfaced about 2 years ago, reaching back out to Kayla through social media, sending birthday texts, making promises about visits that sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. I knew he'd been back in the picture. I was fine with it. Kayla had the right to know her biological father. I never said a word against it. But seeing him walk in beside Diane, dressed in a new suit, carrying a bouquet bigger than mine, settling into the seat directly to my wife's left, I sat very still. Diane leaned over and said, quietly, "Derek is going to sit with us." Kayla asked. I nodded. I looked down at my sunflowers. I said, "Okay." The ceremony started. Thousands of students in black gowns walked across the field to the music. I watched for Kayla the way I always watched for her, the way I watched for her in every school play, every soccer game, every choir performance for the past 11 years. I knew the way she moved. The slight tilt of her chin when she was nervous, the way she touched her hair with her left hand before she stepped into any spotlight. When they called her name, I stood up. I clapped. I felt that tight, proud thing in my chest that doesn't have a word for it, the one that means I watched to become this. Diane stood. Gloria stood. Derek stood and let out a loud whoop. Kayla crossed the stage. She looked out at the crowd. She found Derek first. She waved at him. She pointed at him. She blew him a kiss. Then she looked at her mother and smiled. I stood there with my hands still clapping, waiting. She didn't look for me. She had already moved on. After the ceremony, we gathered on the lawn for photographs. Kayla came running across the grass in her gown and cap, diploma in hand, and she threw her arms around Diane first, then around Gloria, then around Derek, who lifted her off the ground and made a sound like this was the moment he'd been building to his whole life. I stood a few feet back with the sunflowers. Kayla turned and saw me. She smiled, a real smile, a warm one. She walked over and hugged me. "Thank you for coming, Marcus," she said. "Not Dad, not even a version of it. Marcus." I hugged her back. I handed her the sunflowers. I told her I was proud of her. She said, "These are so pretty." And then someone called her name for another photo, and she was gone. Back into the orbit of Diane and Derek and the photographer Diane had hired. I stood on that lawn for another 45 minutes. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I held someone's bag. I watched Derek put his arm around my wife for a photograph, and I watched her let him. Then I said I was going to get the car pulled around. I walked to the parking structure alone. I sat in my car for a long time. I didn't cry. I was past the age of crying over things that had been building for years. What I felt instead was something quieter and heavier. Like the moment you realize a weight you've been carrying is actually a door you were never meant to hold open. I put the car in drive. I started thinking very clearly. I want to tell you something about the 11 years before that afternoon, because I think it matters. I was 61 years old. I had spent 30 years as a civil engineer. I had built a good life, not a flashy one, not a loud one, but a solid one. When I met Diane, I was 50, recently divorced, and not looking for anything complicated. She was 44, warm and funny, and raising a daughter alone in a house that needed more repairs than she could manage. I fell in love with both of them, if I'm honest. Not the same way, but Kayla was part of the package, and I never wanted it any other way. I coached her soccer team for 3 seasons. I helped her with calculus at the kitchen table every night for 2 semesters. When she didn't get into her first choice school and cried for an entire evening, I sat outside her bedroom door and slid encouraging notes under it until she started laughing. When she got into Michigan, I was the one who screamed. I paid for Michigan because I wanted to, because she had worked hard and I had the means, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Diane offered to contribute when she could, and she did sometimes, but the bulk of it was mine. Tuition, housing, meal plans, the laptop she needed sophomore year, the study abroad application fee, the deposit for her first post-graduation apartment in Chicago that she'd signed 2 weeks earlier. $62,000 over 4 years. I am not saying that to put a number on love. I'm saying it because by the time I drove home from Ann Arbor that afternoon, I had decided that the accounting was done. I got home before Diane. She was taking Derek and Gloria to dinner. She had mentioned it that morning, casually, the way you mention something you've already decided and are informing rather than discussing. I had said, "Have a nice time." The house was quiet when I walked in. I went upstairs and changed out of my good clothes. I came back down and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen. I wrote 2 columns. On the left, I wrote down everything I was still financially connected to that touched Kayla or touched Diane's obligations to Kayla. The apartment deposit I'd co-signed in Chicago. The monthly transfer I'd set up to help with Kayla's first few months of rent while she started her job. The phone plan she was still on. The small investment account I had started for her when she was 10 that was now worth almost $14,000. On the right, I wrote down what I was going to do about each one. It took me about 20 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. He's a man I've known for 30 years, a man who does not ask unnecessary questions. I told him I needed to talk through a few things first thing Monday morning. He said he'd clear his schedule. Then I called my financial advisor and left a message asking her to flag the co-signed lease and the investment account for discussion. Then I sat back and looked at the legal pad. I wasn't angry. That surprised me, actually. I had expected anger, had braced for it on the drive home. But what I felt was something closer to resolution. Like a conversation that had been half finished for years had finally reached its last sentence. I folded the legal pad, put it in my briefcase, and made myself dinner. Diane came home around 9. She was in a good mood. She told me about the restaurant, told me Derek had been funny, told me Kayla was so happy and looked so beautiful. She moved around the kitchen, getting water and kicking off her heels and telling me about her day, the way she always did, comfortably, without noticing whether I was really listening. I listened. When she finished, I said, "I'm glad she had a good day." Diane looked at me. "You okay?" I said. "I'm fine." She said, "You're quiet." I said, "It was a long drive." She accepted that. She kissed me on the cheek and went upstairs to get ready for bed. I stayed at the kitchen table a while longer. I looked at the oak tree through the window. It was dark out, and I could only see the outline of it against the neighbor's porch light. I thought about Kayla saying Marcus in that bright, breezy way, like I was a family friend, like 11 years was just context. I thought about the way Derek whooped when she crossed the stage. I thought about the sunflowers she'd left on her chair when she went to take pictures. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I want to be clear about that. Self-pity is a room I refuse to live in. What I felt was simpler than that. I felt like a man who had finally been handed a very honest piece of information and who had the clarity to know what to do with it. Monday morning, I met with my attorney for 2 hours. Tuesday afternoon, I spoke with my financial advisor. By Wednesday, I had sent a certified letter to the leasing office in Chicago, formally withdrawing my co-signature from Kayla's apartment lease and noting that I would not be responsible for any financial obligations under that agreement going forward. My attorney advised me on how to do it cleanly, and it was done cleanly. By Thursday, I had restructured the investment account. I did not drain it. That felt wrong, because I had started it for a child I loved, and I still loved her, even now. But I moved it into a structure that required my explicit authorization for any disbursements, and I removed the automatic transfer I had set up for her monthly support. The phone plan I handled Friday morning, 2 minutes on a website. Done. I did none of this with noise. I did not call Diane into a room and deliver a speech. I did not send Kayla a letter explaining my reasoning. I did not post anything or tell my friends or perform my grievance for an audience. I just stopped. When you have been a steady, quiet source of support for 11 years, stopping is its own kind of statement. You don't need to shout it. The silence is very loud on its own. The first call came 9 days later. It was a Thursday evening. I was on my back porch reading when my phone rang. It was Kayla. I answered. She said, "Marcus, there's something wrong with the lease. The leasing office sent me something saying you withdrew from the co-signature." I said, "That's correct." She was quiet for a moment. "Then why?" I said. "I've been doing some restructuring of my finances." She said, "But I move in 6 weeks. They might not approve me on my own." "My salary won't," I said. "I understand. You'll want to look into your options. You might consider asking your father." Another silence. Longer this time. She said quietly. "Marcus, what's going on?" I said. "Nothing is going on, Kayla. I wish you well. I genuinely do." I let the pause sit there between us, full and honest. Then I said, "Congratulations again on your graduation. You worked hard for that degree." And I let her go. Diane was a different conversation. She came to me 2 days after Kayla called. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd written my 2 columns, though she didn't know that, and she looked at me with an expression that mixed confusion and something I recognized as the beginning of understanding. She said, "Kayla says you withdrew from her lease." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you stopped the monthly transfer?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Marcus, why are you doing this?" I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. I had spent 2 weeks thinking about this, actually, what I would say when we finally sat down and talked about it. I had rehearsed sharper versions, harder versions, versions that laid out every transaction and every sacrifice and every moment I had spent building something I apparently wasn't fully part of. But sitting there across from her, I found I didn't want any of those versions. I said, "At the graduation, when Kayla crossed the stage, she looked for you. She looked for her grandmother. She looked for Derek. She didn't look for me." Diane opened her mouth. I held up my hand gently. "I'm not saying she owed me a wave. She doesn't owe me anything. But I'm 61 years old, Diane, and I paid for that diploma she was holding, and I've been her father in every way I knew how to be for 11 years, and in that moment I understood clearly and finally where I actually stand." Diane said, "That's not fair." She was just excited, and I said, "And Derek." She stopped. I said, "You put Derek next to you at her graduation. You didn't ask me, you informed me, and you let him be in the photographs in the place where I expected to be." I paused. "I'm not angry about it. I want you to hear that I'm not. But I would be lying to myself if I pretended it didn't mean something." Diane was quiet. I said, "I have loved your daughter like she was mine. And I think, if I am being honest, that I have loved the idea of this family more than this family has needed me to. There is a difference between being loved and being useful. I got those 2 things confused for a long time." I stood up from the table. I said, "I'm going to stay with my brother in Cincinnati for a few weeks. I've already called him. I think we could use some time to think about what we both actually want." Diane said, "Marcus, please," I said. "I'm not leaving in anger. I want you to know that." I picked up my coffee cup and rinsed it at the sink, and I set it in the drying rack the way I always did. I'm leaving because I think clearly when I have space, and I think you do too. I had already packed a bag. It was by the door. I stayed in Cincinnati for 3 weeks. My brother James is 73. Retired, and the least dramatic person I have ever met in my life. He made me coffee every morning and didn't ask me questions I wasn't ready to answer. We watched baseball. We took long walks. We argued about whether the designated hitter rule had improved or ruined the sport, which is an argument we have been having since 1987 and which neither of us will ever win. It was exactly what I needed. Diane called. I answered some of those calls. We talked. Real talks. Not the half talks we've been having for years. She was upset, then defensive, then honest in a way she hadn't been in a long time. She told me she hadn't realized how much of the weight I'd been carrying quietly. She told me Derek's reappearance had made her feel things she hadn't sorted out yet. She told me she was sorry about the graduation, that it had been thoughtless, and she knew it. I believed her. I also knew that being believed wasn't the same as things being fixed. Kayla called once. She was more subdued than the first call. She didn't mention the lease. She asked how I was doing, and I told her honestly. She said she had been thinking about the graduation and that she was sorry she hadn't looked for me in the crowd. She said she didn't know why she hadn't, she said, and I could hear it cost her something to say it. You've always been there. I think I just took that for granted. I said, I know. I didn't tell her it was okay, because I don't believe in saying things are okay when they aren't, and I don't believe in pretending pain away just to make a moment more comfortable. What I told her instead was the truth. I love you, Kayla. That hasn't changed. But love has to be something two people are both in, or it just becomes one person carrying a door. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is that something Uncle Leonard used to say? And despite everything, I laughed, because she was right. It sounded like something my late Uncle Leonard would have said. He was a man who spoke in the kind of plain, worn wisdom that sounds like it should be on a plaque somewhere, but only comes from having actually lived through something. I said, maybe he did. Maybe I'm finally old enough to mean it. I am back home now. I will not tell you that everything is resolved, because it isn't. Not the way people like to hear stories resolve, all tied up and certain. Diane and I are in counseling. We are talking about things that should have been talked about years ago. Some of those conversations are hard. Some of them have surprised me. The investment account for Kayla, I reinstated the transfer. Not because I was asked to, and not to buy anything. I did it because the money was always meant for her, and punishing her financially for a moment that was thoughtless but not malicious isn't something I can justify to myself. Love, I've learned, doesn't always need a receipt. What I withdrew wasn't money. It was the version of myself that kept giving without asking whether the door went both ways. The co-signature on the lease, though, that stayed withdrawn. She found a roommate to co-sign instead. She is managing. She is 22 years old and capable. And sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone is stop absorbing consequences. They are ready to absorb themselves. I am 61 years old. I have a good attorney, a patient financial advisor, and a brother who argues about baseball with me like we are still 15. I have an oak tree in my backyard that grew taller than the fence. I have a stepdaughter who called me Marcus at her graduation, and who called me again last week just to talk, and who spoke to me differently than she ever has. Like someone who has started to understand that the people who show up quietly deserve to be looked for in the crowd. I don't need a trophy for what I did over 11 years. I was not looking for applause. But I am old enough now to know that a man who gives without limit is not virtuous. He is just waiting to be emptied. And when you feel yourself going empty, the kindest thing you can do for everyone, including yourself, is to stop. Set the door down. Look at what you've been holding and ask whether it was ever really yours to carry alone. That morning at the graduation, I held sunflowers for 45 minutes while someone else took pictures with my daughter. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time in a long time, I thought very clearly. Sometimes clarity doesn't come with noise. It doesn't come with an argument or a breakdown or a dramatic scene in a restaurant parking lot. Sometimes it comes in the quiet of a house you've lived in for 11 years, at a kitchen table you've eaten at 1,000 times, with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and the particular peace that settles over a man who has finally decided to tell himself the truth. That's the thing about getting older, if you're paying attention. You stop waiting for someone else to notice your worth. You just start living like it was never in question. If any part of this story sat with you, if you recognized something in it, something you've been carrying, something you've been trying to name, I'd like to know. Leave it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're thinking. I read everyone. I'm Uncle Leonard, and I'll see you in the next one.